For 8 hours, the most feared man on earth lies dying on his dacha floor because the guards will not open the door and no one calls a doctor through the night. March 1st, 1953. Joseph Stalin is unconscious in his pajamas at Kuntsevo, soaked in his own urine. Doctors won't come for hours. When they finally do, they put leeches on his face and neck. 4 days later, he is dead of a hemorrhagic stroke at 74. This is how the Soviet Union's longest ruling leader dies. And he is not the only one. From Lenin to Gorbachev, every Soviet leader leaves a documented death, stroke, heart failure, kidney failure, emphysema, and one man thrown out alive and buried as a pensioner. This is how every Soviet leader died. Start with the founder, already mute and bedridden at Gorki. Vladimir Lenin is 53 years old. After a third stroke the year before, he can barely speak, mute for long stretches, bedridden at the Gorki estate, roughly 20 miles from Moscow. On the afternoon of January 21st, 1924, his breathing fails. By 1850, he is dead. The official cause is a final stroke on a brain wrecked by cerebral atherosclerosis. At autopsy, physicians find arteries so calcified that when tapped with forceps they sound like stone, in a man who was not obese and did not smoke. That autopsy color is the medical record's answer, not a rumor diagnosis. His body will be embalmed for the Red Square mausoleum against his widow's wishes, preserved on display while the living struggle over who rules next. The revolution's founder dies of hardened vessels, not a bullet and not a poison plot the medical record can prove. The next man to inherit that power will rule longer than anyone, and die on a dacha floor while the country waits days to be told. The stroke that kills him is the last in a chain, the third major cerebral event in under 2 years, and the medical bulletin that follows is careful, official, and final. Joseph Stalin has ruled longer than anyone. On the night of February 28th into March 1st, 1953, he drinks late at the near dacha, the Kuntsevo compound outside Moscow, with the inner circle, then retires. Around 2300 on March 1st, staff find him on the floor, unconscious, incontinent, soaked in urine, the cold open image now in full. They carry him to a sofa. Leadership delays calling doctors through the night. Physicians do not arrive until roughly 7 the next morning, an 8-hour gap while the most powerful man in the country lies dying. Blood pressure climbs past 200 over 120. Treatment includes leeches on the face and neck to bring the pressure down. He dies at 2150 on March 5th of a hemorrhagic stroke in the left cerebral hemisphere, age 74, 4 days after he was found. Poisoning theories will circulate for decades. The medical consensus is natural hypertensive stroke. At the funeral, Khrushchev later estimated at least 109 people died in the crowd crushed trying to see the body. The man who terrorized doctors dies with leeches on his face, and ordinary mourners die trying to look at him. Radio Moscow will announce the death the next day in the voice of Yuri Levitan. Until then, the country still formally has a living leader while the body cools at Kuntsevo. Georgy Malenkov briefly holds the premiership after Stalin, then fades. He will die almost forgotten in 1988. The man who actually takes the country is Nikita Khrushchev. On October 14, 1964, while he is away from Moscow, the Presidium forces his resignation. He is not shot. He is erased from power, stripped of the top job and kept under watch. For 7 years he lives as a supervised special pensioner near Moscow, writing memoirs that are smuggled west. On September 11, 1971, a heart attack kills him at 77. The state denies him a state funeral and Kremlin wall burial. He is buried at Novodevichy cemetery and announced coolly as a pensioner, as if the man who once ran the country had never ruled. He is the only top Soviet leader removed alive. When he dies, the system buries him as if he never sat at the top. After him, removal stops being the method. The next 3 leaders will not be forced out. They will simply die one after another in under 3 years. The black and white marble monument his family later commissions at Novodevichy will be one of the few public marks that he ever held power at all. Leonid Brezhnev is 75 and visibly failing. On November 7, 1982, he stands roughly 2 hours atop Lenin's mausoleum in sub-freezing weather for the Revolution Day parade, tinted glasses, little animation, helped on the stairs by aides who keep him upright for the cameras. 3 days later, on the morning of November 10th, around 8:30, he is found motionless in bed. Official cause: sudden heart failure on chronic arteriosclerosis and ischemic heart disease, age 75. The public announcement waits until November 11th, a full day of silence while the country still formally has a living general secretary. The man who stood in the cold on Lenin's tomb dies in bed, and the state takes a day to say so. His death opens the 1982-85 cascade. 3 leaders will be gone in under 3 years. The next one is already sick and will rule from a hospital ward the public is not allowed to see. Autopsy language from TASS lists aortic arteriosclerosis, coronary stenosis, and scars from prior heart attacks, a body that had been failing in public for years. Yuri Andropov, former KGB chief, becomes general secretary after Brezhnev. He is already sick. From February 1983, within months of taking power, he is on hemodialysis. His last verified public appearance is August 18, 1983, meeting United States senators in the Kremlin. Then he vanishes from public view into the Central Clinical Hospital. For roughly half a year, the Soviet Union is ruled from a dialysis ward while the public is not told how sick he is. On February 9, 1984, at 1650, he dies of kidney failure cascading into heart and respiratory failure, age 69, after roughly 15 months in power. The former secret police chief spends his last months governing a superpower from a hospital bed. 15 months after Brezhnev's death, the second leader of the cascade is gone. The third is already waiting in the wings, a lifelong heavy smoker with chronic emphysema and failing lungs, who will last under 13 months. Official reports will speak of interstitial nephritis and secondary hypertension. For months before the end, dialysis is what keeps the general secretary alive. Konstantin Chernenko is a lifelong heavy smoker with chronic emphysema before he ever takes the top job. On February 24, 1985, after weeks off camera, state TV shows him casting a ballot, wheezing, unsteady, few words, an aide steadying him so he can finish the gesture. Newspapers airbrushed the aide out of the next day's photos. On March 10th, at 1920, his heart stops amid pulmonary emphysema and cardiac insufficiency. He is 73. Tenure, under 13 months. Count the cascade out loud. Brezhnev dies in November 1982. Andropov dies in February 1984. Chernenko dies in March 1985. 3 Soviet leaders dead in under 3 years, 28 months from the first body to the third. The gerontocracy does not reform. It expires on camera, one wheezing ballot at a time. The man who inherits what is left will outlive the Soviet Union itself, and die decades later without a published cause of death. Viewers who have watched the prior 2 funerals already know what a programming shift to classical music means. By March 1985, the pattern is a public ritual. Mikhail Gorbachev is the last general secretary of the Soviet Union, and the only one born under it who dies after it is gone. He inherits a system that has just buried 3 old men in 28 months, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and outlives the country they ran. On August 30th, 2022, decades after the Union dissolved, he dies at the Central Clinical Hospital in Moscow at 91. The hospital cites a serious and protracted disease. No specific medical cause of death is published, not an organ, not a named illness, only that official line. He is buried at Novodevichy cemetery beside Ryasa. The farewell has honor guard elements but not a full state funeral. Vladimir Putin lays flowers at the coffin and does not attend the funeral, citing his schedule. The last Soviet leader gets ceremony without full state honors, and an official cause of death the public never receives. The chronological march from Lenin to Gorbachev ends here. What the pattern of their deaths actually shows is still waiting. He is the longest lived of the Soviet leaders, 91 years, and the only one whose death belongs to a Russia that is no longer the Soviet Union. How every Soviet leader died is not a mystery of assassins. It is a medical ledger. Lenin and Stalin die of catastrophic brain disease, vessels of stone at Gorki, a hemorrhagic stroke on a Kuntsevo dacha floor after an 8-hour wait for doctors. Khrushchev dies of a heart attack after being thrown out alive and buried as a pensioner at Novodevichy. Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko die of failing hearts, kidneys, and lungs in a 28-month cascade, November 82, February 84, March 85, that ends the gerontocracy by extinction. Gorbachev dies decades later of an unspecified long illness after the country they built has already vanished. The pattern is cardiovascular collapse, secrecy, delayed announcements, and a system that could not admit its leaders were dying until the bodies forced the issue. That is the documented answer to how every Soviet leader died. 7 men. 7 documented endings. No need for a poison plot to explain the ledger. Next, the first human to walk in space. Alexei Leonov balloons rigid outside his airlock and cannot get back in. How the first spacewalk nearly became the first death in space.